Hi, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney and a guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. I have, from time to time, been known to observe that the difference between a war story and a fairy tale is a fairy tale starts off once upon a time, and a war story starts off, you're not going to believe this, but. So today we're telling a war story. I'll have more in just a moment. The year would have been 1997, and I had just started work for the second time for a very good friend who had been a Supreme Court judge and who was now running the legal briefing team for the state of Missouri's trial tobacco team. The state of Missouri had, like many states in the 1990s, filed a lawsuit against Big Tobacco and all of the big tobacco manufacturers and wanted to seek retribution for all of the money that they had spent on Medicaid on behalf of patients who had acquired smoking-related diseases. Now, what was interesting about this lawsuit is that it was based on the Missouri Merchandising Practices Act. Although we were acting on behalf of the state as Special Assistant Attorneys General, we were all working out of our own individual law firms. Our job as the legal briefing team was to respond to motions from all the different companies when they came in. And every now and then you would get an interesting motion, and one of the motions that gave us the most trouble up front was from British American Tobacco. Now, British American Tobacco owned a large segment of the American tobacco market, and they were ostensibly headquartered in England, but they had operations in the United States, and they filed a motion to dismiss on the basis of personal jurisdiction. Now, personal jurisdiction wasn't decided really well at that point in time, and there really wasn't much of a way for us to establish personal jurisdiction other than to show that they had actively engaged in commerce in Missouri, which they had, and also that they knew some of these risks. It was really an opportunity for us to preview some of the material that we would use in the case later on. One of the things about personal jurisdiction is you have to show activities that were directed specifically into the state. In other words, it's not enough to say, well, we made cigarettes and they were sold all over the United States. You have to show that there was some targeting. At least that was the status of the law then. So we had done what's called jurisdictional discovery. And when you do jurisdictional discovery, you ask for things like, who are your agents in Missouri, who sells your products in Missouri, that sort of thing. And of course, the general approach to that sort of jurisdictional discovery by defendants is to hand over 4 or 5 documents and object to everything else and make you fight to get every single document. So we did not have a great deal of documentation to rely upon that we had obtained in discovery. Now, we had obtained some other things from the other states' cases. They had shared certain documents, but many of them had been placed under a protective order. In other words, we couldn't use them in our case because they were protected in another case. The only way we could get them is if we got them fair and square in discovery. So we had filed our initial response to the motion for personal jurisdiction, or to dismiss on the basis of personal jurisdiction, and they filed a reply, and then about 48 hours before we were set to go argue this case in front of a judge in St. Louis City, they served an affidavit that, no joke, was 6 inches tall, and it had hundreds upon hundreds of documents, and the documents were attached to an affidavit by a professor by the name of Charles Strobaugh. And Charles Strobaugh was the Harvard professor, and he purported to show in this affidavit why there was no personal jurisdiction. So when we got to looking through this affidavit, and it was clearly more information than they ever expected us to read, we broke it up amongst the 4 team members, and we started looking for things that had some impact on our case. And we found just absolute solid gold in this. So I was sort of the technical lawyer in the department, and my job was to put all of this into a PowerPoint presentation with excerpts from the documents that would scroll up on the screen and give the judge a little bit more information about why there was personal jurisdiction. So I probably spent the better part of 12 to 14 hours putting this PowerPoint together, because we had to scan the documents, then we had to crop the documents. We had to put all of the documents that we used into a binder so that we could give that to the judge, so he would have the actual copies of the full document, so that nobody could later say, hey, well, you took it out of context, when we hadn't. Anyway, the bottom line was we did a lot of work, and we put this into a PowerPoint, and we went through the PowerPoint several times. And then the day came when we had to go to St. Louis and argue this particular motion. Well, when Big Tobacco calls a corporate law firm and says jump, those lawyers jump and ask how high on the way up, because they will bend over backwards to get some of that sweet tobacco money. And there were several local big law firms in the courtroom that morning, and there was also a hot shot from a law firm in New York who had been specifically retained to come down and teach those hicks down in Missouri all about personal jurisdiction. Well, when you are the person who has filed the motion, you get to go first because you have the burden of proof. So Mr. $1,500 sharkskin suit gets up and starts talking in a very folksy manner, as if, well, Judge, we're just home folks here. Sure, I'm from New York, but I'm just going to talk plain business to you. I don't think it was quite that bad, but we all just kind of looked at each other like, really? This is what this guy is going to do? Anyway, he went through his motion and basically kind of read the motion to the court. And having made all of the points that he had made in his motion, he sat down. So then it was our turn. We fired up the PowerPoint, projected it onto the screen, and my boss started talking about personal jurisdiction. He laid out the law, and then he started flipping up these documents that had been produced in the affidavit. Because we didn't need any other documents in this case to prove personal jurisdiction other than the ones they gave us 48 hours before the hearing, which may have been the stupidest thing that any person had ever done in the course of litigation, but at least up to that point. So as we put these documents up on the screen and we highlight the areas in the screen where all these things are mentioned, there's this low rumble from the defense table. And I know I heard several times, where did they get that? What? How did they get that? That's covered by a protective order. And the beehive just started buzzing on the other side. And of course, I know where the documents came from, right? I'm laughing my socks off at this point because I know what's coming. And sure enough, my boss talked for about 45 minutes, and then he sat down, and it was like that little thing on a Jack in the Box, where you crank it, it goes all around the mulberry bush, and then pop, up goes the weasel, right? Well, up comes the weasel. The $1,500 an hour shark-suited lawyer jumps up and says, we're going to object to that whole line of argument. They got all these documents. We didn't give them those documents. Those documents were stolen. They're covered by protective orders in other cases. Their mothers are ugly. They dress them funny. The whole 9 yards. It was an absolute brilliant dance on the part of the lawyer from New York. And so the judge looked at my boss and said, now, sir, would you like to respond to this? And he held up the 6-inch bunch of documents from the affidavit and said, Judge, all of these documents came from the Strobaugh affidavit that was filed with the court. You've seen that Strobel affidavit, I'm sure. If you have any question about any of these documents that are in our notebook, you will also find them in the Strobel affidavit. Well, I'm pretty sure somebody at one of those law firms got fired that day, because they clearly should have looked at the documents that this Professor Strobel reviewed and decided whether or not to file that affidavit, because they didn't really need it. And perhaps most importantly, personal jurisdiction is decided on the basis of the pleadings and the allegations. It is almost never decided on the basis of evidence. And as a result of that, because they filed this evidence, it sort of polluted the whole thing for them. If they had left this affidavit out, there wouldn't have been anything we could have pointed to that we had in our possession that would have been as powerful as what they gave us 2 days before the event. And they served that at 5 o'clock they served it at like 5 o'clock on a Wednesday night, and our argument was 8 o'clock on Friday morning. So the only day we really had to work on it was Thursday. Anyway, we never got a ruling on the personal jurisdiction motion. And that was because the tobacco companies saw the handwriting on the wall. And they decided they needed to minimize the impact of what these attorney generals were doing. And they came to the table and they announced a master settlement. Several other law firms around the country had been working on a master settlement. And the Attorney General for the state of Missouri sort of pulled the rug out from underneath all of us and entered into this master settlement. And then we had to go fight with the tobacco companies for our fees at arbitration. And that was certainly no fun. But the bottom line was that sometimes in litigation, people do really dumb things. You may recall recently Alex Jones's attorney providing documents to the other side that essentially made the case for punitive damages. That lawyer was suspended as a result. I strongly believe that whoever gave us that Strobel affidavit was probably fired before noon that day in St. Louis. So that's what I have for you. It's a war story. Hopefully it's a little bit funny. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching, and have a marvelous day. If you like this video, here are a few others you might try, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a terrific day, guys.